A day in the life of a Commodore 64. The Commodore 64. Once you get it, you'll wonder how you got along without it.
Back in the 1980s, you were one of the cool kids if you had a Commodore 64. It was the PlayStation of its era, the machine everybody wanted to publish their games on. The C64 launched in 1982 as a follow-up to Commodore's successful VIC-20. Fundamentally, the Commodore 64 was very similar to the VIC-20 in design, but made many upgrades. The RAM was increased from 5 kilobytes to 64, hence the name Commodore 64. The graphics of the Commodore 64 were provided by the 320 by 200 resolution 16-color VIC-2 chip that added sprite support, which was something the VIC-20 lacked. Both computers used the DEC-9 joystick port found on the Atari 2600, and a second port was added for two-player games. In the area of sound, the Commodore 64 had a massive upgrade with the SID chip. This provided a whopping 3 channels of sound with 3 oscillating and 4 wave sound voices with support for ADSR and ring modulation, which allowed software makers to produce a much broader range of unique sounds for music and sound effects. The C64 was also compatible with some of the VIC-20's peripherals, which made upgrading a bit easier for families that already owned a VIC-20. In the Guinness Book of World Records, the Commodore 64 is listed as the highest-selling single computer of all time. When its 13-year run ended in 1994, the Commodore 64 had a library of over 10,000 games. The PlayStation 4 today has just over 800. Throughout the early 2000s, the Commodore 64 saw a resurgence in developing countries. For years, it sold well in Brazil. And since it was technically a computer, it bypassed China's ban on game consoles. When the video game crash hit in 1983, a lot of game companies went under. But it wasn't the end of video games, as the home computer revolution was experiencing a golden age. Some game developers that supported 8-bit computers along with consoles survived the crash. You may have heard of names like Electronic Arts and Activision. Technically, Atari is still around, though it's not the same Atari from back then. Speaking of Activision, they were one of the more popular game makers for the Atari 2600. Atari, as a policy, didn't credit the people who actually made their games. So some Atari employees left the company to form their own studio, and thus Activision was born. Activision looked to turn their game developers into household names, and one of the first to achieve that success was David Crane. He made a little game called Pitfall, which became a huge hit, and its popularity was also likely influenced by a little movie called Raiders of the Lost Ark. Pitfall remained in the top 10 charts for 64 weeks and sold more than Atari's E.T. Here's some interesting trivia. The TV commercial for Pitfall starred a young 13-year-old Jack Black. Yes, that Jack Black, the actor, who also hosts his own gaming channel here on YouTube, Jablinski Games. Pitfall was also ported to other consoles and computers like the Dragon 32, MSX, Atari 800, and the Commodore 64. That's the version we're looking at today. As you can see, it gets a slight visual upgrade from the Atari 2600 version, but overall still plays the same. This is the C64 cartridge version, but it was also available on floppy disk and cassette tape. Yes, cassette. That was a thing back then. You think load times were bad now? Try loading games on tape or cassette on these old 8-bit computers. Then you can complain. The premise is simple. You run around as Pitfall Harry jumping over many hazards, and swinging on vines in the jungle while collecting treasure. Some say this game was the birth of the side-scrolling platformer, though it didn't scroll really. Either way, Pitfall was a huge win for Activision, and made David Crane something of a celebrity. Next time, we'll take a look at Pitfall's sequel. I've been Mike TheZorch, and I'll see you in the next video. If you like this video, consider subscribing to our channel. Also, visit the Gamers Bay community. You will find us on MeWe, the only social media network that does not collect your data and will never sell your data. And if you'd like to support our channel, visit the Gamers Bay store where you can find retro games, movies, and more. All links are in the video description.